The map exists in the IDF archives under reference number 1973/G HQ/Syrian-October. It's a Syrian General Staff operational overlay, captured intact at a forward command post 3 days after the fighting started. Someone laminated it at some point. The acetate has yellowed. What matters is the red arrows, 17 of them, each representing a battalion-size thrust across the purple line into the Golan Heights. They converge on a series of blue circles, Israeli positions, that Syrian planners expected to overwhelm through simple arithmetic. The arrows are neat, confident. They don't show contingency routes because the planners didn't think they'd need any. The terrain they planned to cross is volcanic basalt plateau. Golan isn't complicated ground. It's a ramp. Syria sits low, Israel sits high, and between them is a slope so gradual you barely notice you're climbing until you check the altimeter. Armor country. The kind of open ground where you can see a tank at 4,000 meters if the air is clear. Syrian intelligence had counted Israeli defensive positions for months. They knew about the 17 fortifications along the ceasefire line. They knew about the tank platoons stationed at each strongpoint. They'd done the math, 82 Syrian tanks per Israeli position on average. Enough to suppress, bypass, or obliterate whatever resisted. The arrows on that map don't slow down until they reach the Jordan River escarpment. That's 42 kilometers from the start line. The operational assumption was straightforward. Israeli armor would recognize the futility and withdraw. Reserve mobilization would take too long. By the time reinforcements arrived, Syrian flags would already be flying over the Bnat Yaakov bridge. The map's annotated in Arabic, which I can't read, but the numbers are clear enough. H hour, 1400 hours. D-Day, October 6th. Commitment, 5 divisions, 1,400 tanks, opening bombardment by 600 artillery pieces. The assault force outnumbered Israeli defenders roughly 9-1 in armor, worse in infantry and guns. What the map doesn't show is fuel capacity. T-55s carried 960 liters internal. At combat consumption rates, stop, fire, maneuver, fire, again, that's maybe 350 kilometers of range. Golan operations required perhaps 100 kilometers round trip from assembly areas to objectives and back. Comfortable margin. Syrian logistics officers had done their homework. The map also doesn't show October 7th or the 8th, because by then the arrows had stopped making sense. Battalions that should have been reporting from grid squares near the Jordan were still fighting on approach routes. Units that had broken through were calling for support that never arrived. And someone, the map doesn't say who, kept asking about a single Israeli tank commander whose radio call sign was Zvika. I've looked at this map maybe a dozen times. The confidence in those arrows is the part that stays with you. 17 thrusts, no branches, no alternates, just geometry and mathematics. The kind of plan that works perfectly until contact, and Syrian planners had every reason to think contact wouldn't matter. The lamination has a crack running through the Quneitra sector. Not sure when that happened. Probably during handling after capture. The crack runs right through one of the red arrows, the one aimed at Tel Faris, where a plateau rises just enough to provide defilade if you know where to position hull down. That's where the math broke. Syrian Captain Khalil Nasser commanded 3rd Company, 2nd Battalion, 7th Infantry Division's Tank Brigade. His testimony comes from a 1981 interview with a Jordanian military journal before he stopped talking about October 1973. He described the approach to Tel Faris as driving toward a door that was already open. The door metaphor wasn't poetic, it was tactical assessment. Syrian reconnaissance had mapped every Israeli position on the Golan Plateau. Tel Faris held, according to pre-war intelligence, 1 reinforced platoon. 4 tanks, maybe 5. Dug in, yes, but isolated. The Israeli doctrine was defense in depth, which meant spreading limited forces across too much front line. Each strongpoint could be fixed and suppressed while the main thrust bypassed. Nasser's company had 14 T-55s. His battalion had 42. The entire divisional push toward Tel Faris committed roughly 180 tanks in the first echelon, another 320 in follow-on waves. He remembers thinking the Israelis would see the dust cloud and pull back. Sensible commanders retreated when facing 20-to-1 odds. The T-55 is a decent tank if you use it correctly. 100mm main gun, decent frontal armor against NATO rounds from the 1950s, low profile. What it's not is a breakthrough vehicle. Soviet doctrine never intended the T-55 to win gunfights at range. The idea was mass and momentum. Suppress the enemy through volume of fire, close rapidly, overwhelm defensive positions through numerical sufficiency before they could inflict unacceptable losses. Syrian crews had trained for exactly this. The approach to Telferis was textbook. Advance in company columns, maintain interval, identify Israeli firing positions through their muzzle flash, suppress with massed fire, continue advance. When one tank died, 2 more pushed through. Mathematics. Nasser's battalion crossed the purple line at 14:23 hours on October 6th. The artillery barrage had lifted 8 minutes prior. Dust hung in the air thick enough that visibility dropped to maybe 800 meters. Good for concealment, bad for target acquisition, acceptable trade-off given the numerical advantage. First contact came at 14:40 hours. One of Nasser's platoon leaders reported taking fire from high ground northeast of their axis. Single tank, estimated range 1,800 meters. The platoon returned fire. 11 rounds, no confirmed hit. The Israeli position went quiet. Probably displaced, standard practice. The company continued advancing. By 15:15 hours, Nasser's company had lost 2 tanks. He couldn't say to what. Fire was coming from multiple directions now, but spotting the shooters was nearly impossible through the dust and heat shimmer. His company had expended maybe 200 rounds. He'd seen 1 Israeli tank burning. The math still worked. Then his battalion commander's voice came over the radio saying something Nasser remembered word for word. All stations. Enemy strength greater than intelligence estimate. Continuing attack. Greater than estimate. Nasser was seeing muzzle flashes from 4, maybe 5 positions. His battalion had lost perhaps 8 tanks by that point, still acceptable against a reinforced company. The confusion was where the fire kept coming from. Syrian doctrine expected Israeli tanks to fire and displace. These ones fired, disappeared, then fired again from a different position minutes later. Or maybe there were more of them than reconnaissance had counted. By nightfall on October 6th, Nasser's company had 3 operational tanks remaining. His battalion had 19. They'd advanced maybe 8 kilometers from the start line. The division's axis of advance had stalled short of objectives, regrouping for night operations. Nasser didn't know how many Israeli tanks he'd been fighting. In 1981, when the interviewer told him the number was 7, he asked them to repeat it. Zvika Greengold was a 21-year-old lieutenant on leave when the war started. He hitched a ride to the Golan at 16:30 hours on October 6th, showed up at a mobilization depot in civilian clothes, and asked for a tank. Someone pointed him at 2 damaged Pattons that mechanics were trying to make operational. The Patton M48A3 in IDF service wasn't cutting edge by 1973. American design from the 1950s, upgraded with the British 105mm L7 gun, decent fire control for its era, reliable if you maintained it. Armor protection was marginal against modern Soviet tank rounds. What it had was a good gun and optics that worked. Greengold got 1 Patton running. He doesn't remember the hull number. Called himself Zvika Force on the radio because he didn't have an actual unit designation. Started driving north toward the sound of artillery at maybe 1800 hours. Picked up 3 more Pattons from a reserve unit along the way, 4 tanks total now. Still calling himself Zvika Force because nobody had told him to stop. First contact happened near Nafik Junction around 19:15 hours. Syrian tanks moving in column formation along the main road, backlit by burning Israeli positions. Greengold counted 12, engaged from maybe 1,200 meters, killed the lead vehicle, watched the column stop. His other 3 tanks engaged. The Syrians returned fire but couldn't spot the Israeli positions in the darkness. The radio traffic from that night is fragmentary. Northern Command kept asking Zvika Force for strength reports. Greengold kept saying, "We're holding," without specifying how many tanks "we" meant. At some point, he had 7 Pattons operational, crews scraped together from stragglers and depot personnel. At other points, he had 4, sometimes 2. One Patton would get hit, the crew would bail. Greengold would find another damaged tank with a working gun, swap crews, continue fighting. Syrian doctrine didn't account for this. Their battle maps showed Israeli positions as static defensive points. You suppressed a position, it either withdrew or died, then you advanced. Zvika Force kept appearing in different grid squares, hitting Syrian columns from unexpected angles, then vanishing before counterfire arrived. The ammunition situation was straightforward desperation. Each Patton carried 63 rounds of 105 mm. Greengold's tanks were firing constantly, at advancing armor, at Syrian infantry trying to flank, at anything that moved. By midnight on October 6th, he was rationing shots. 1 round per target unless absolutely certain of a kill. Northern command logs show repeated requests for Zvika Force's position and strength. Greengold's responses were evasive. Engage near Nafesh. Multiple contacts. Holding. The headquarters staff assumed he was commanding a company, maybe a battalion. The idea that 7 tanks were blunting a divisional thrust didn't fit the mathematics of armored warfare. By dawn on October 7th, Greengold had been fighting for 13 straight hours. 3 of his original 7 Pattons were burning. He'd gathered 4 more from a reserve depot that was under artillery fire. Syrian forces had pushed to within 2 kilometers of Nafek. Division headquarters was preparing to evacuate. Then Syrian radio traffic started showing confusion. Unit commanders reporting conflicting positions, asking for clarification on enemy strength, requesting artillery support against concentrations that intelligence said shouldn't exist. The Syrian push was still coming, still had overwhelming numbers, but the momentum had fractured into separate battalion actions instead of one coordinated divisional thrust. Greengold kept fighting. The radio call sign Zvika Force stayed on the air, and Syrian commanders kept trying to solve a tactical problem that didn't match their operational planning. The Hebrew term is nihul tipulim, ammunition management. Sounds bureaucratic. What it meant for Greengold's crews was counting every shell like currency you couldn't replace. 63 rounds per Patton. That's the total load. 54 in the ready rack and hull storage, 9 more in less accessible positions. Against a Syrian divisional assault, 63 rounds is maybe 40 minutes of sustained combat if you're disciplined. Less if you're not. IDF armor doctrine in 1973 emphasized first-round hits. Training standards required 80% accuracy at battle ranges. Not because Israeli tankers were naturally better shots, but because they couldn't afford to miss. Syrian crews trained to suppress through volume. Spray 12 rounds at a suspected position, maybe 2 connect, acceptable loss ratio when you're fielding 1,400 tanks. Israeli crews had to make different calculations. Greengold's gunners were firing at ranges between 800 and 2,200 meters, mostly at night against moving targets, often while their own tank was repositioning. First-round hit probability under those conditions is maybe 40% even with good training, which meant every engagement required 2, sometimes 3 rounds to ensure a kill. Multiply that across dozens of contacts per hour, and the math gets ugly fast. The term nihul itself is interesting. It doesn't translate cleanly to management in the Western sense. Closer to conducting or leading, the way you'd conduct an orchestra, not manage inventory. There's an implied artistry to it, a sense that you're working with limited resources to create something larger than the sum of parts. Israeli military terminology does this often, using words that carry cultural weight beyond their literal meaning. Tipulim means treatments or handling, but in military context it refers specifically to ordnance, to the physical acts of loading, storing, accounting for ammunition. Put them together and nihul tipulim becomes something like the art of making every round count, which sounds poetic until you're the gunner watching your ammunition counter drop from 63 to 42 to 27, and the Syrian tanks keep coming. Greengold's crews developed patterns. Engage lead vehicle first, stop the column. Engage last vehicle second, trap them. Middle vehicles would button up, hesitate, become easier targets. Sometimes you'd fire one round near a Syrian position just to provoke them into shooting back, revealing their location to other Israeli tanks who'd make the actual kill. One round as bait, saving two. They'd also learned which targets to ignore. Syrian infantry carriers weren't worth 105mm rounds unless they were directly threatening your position. Let them pass, focus on the tanks. A BMP-1 could kill you, sure, but a T-55 would kill you first and from farther away. Prioritization became instinctive. By October 8th, Greengold's surviving tanks were pulling rounds from knocked-out Israeli vehicles. You'd find a burning Patton, check if the ammunition storage had cooked off, salvage anything intact. 12 rounds from one wreck, 8 from another. The crews stopped thinking in terms of a per-tank loadout and started thinking in terms of total rounds available to Zvika Force. Pooled resources. I'm spending too much time on this. The point is that ammunition discipline wasn't just doctrine. It was survival mathematics imposed by industrial capacity and logistics. Israeli armor couldn't fight the way Syrian armor fought because Israel couldn't build tanks as fast as Syria's Soviet suppliers could ship them. So they built doctrine around scarcity, gave it a Hebrew name that sounded almost elegant, and trained crews to internalize rationing as reflex. Greengold's units fired an estimated 3,400 rounds during 4 days of combat. Soviet doctrine would have expended that in 6 hours. The AN/VSS 3 searchlight mount on the M48. A3 Patton wasn't a thermal sight. That's important. In 1973, thermal imaging for tanks was experimental American technology, not fielded yet, definitely not something Israel had, in quantity. What the Patton had was a white light/infrared searchlight paired with an infrared scope. Works like this. The searchlight emits infrared light invisible to the naked eye. Your gunner looks through an IR scope that converts that light into a visible green image. Enemy tanks without IR equipment see nothing. You see them as green shapes against black background. Effective range may be 800 meters on a clear night, less if there's dust or humidity. Syrian T-55s had similar systems, the Luna infrared searchlight. Soviet export model, slightly less sophisticated than what the Red Army kept for itself, but functional. The problem wasn't equipment parity. The problem was doctrine and training. Soviet night fighting doctrine in 1973 assumed you'd use infrared in coordination with other units. Multiple tanks illuminate the same sector, infantry provides flank security, artillery suppresses suspected positions before your armor advances. Systematic. The Syrian crews had trained this way, coordinated night operations with full divisional support. What they hadn't trained for was isolated night combat after your command structure has fragmented and nobody's sure where friendly units are anymore. By nightfall, October 6th, Syrian battalion cohesion was breaking down. Companies were scattered across the Golan Plateau, some ahead of schedule, some stalled, communications degrading as radio discipline collapsed under stress. Israeli crews were fighting differently. Greengold's tanks would move to a firing position in darkness, kill engines, wait. When a Syrian column appeared, they'd engage with the main gun using passive night sights, starlight scopes that amplified ambient light without emitting anything detectable. Only if they needed illumination would they trigger the infrared searchlight, and then just for seconds. Shoot, kill the light, displace. The Syrians would see the muzzle flash, return fire at that position, illuminate with their own IR searchlights to acquire targets. But Greengold's tank had already moved. The Syrian searchlights would sweep across empty ground, while Israeli tanks fired from different positions entirely. There's a physics problem here that doctrine doesn't solve. Infrared searchlights have finite range. If you're fighting at 1,500 meters and your searchlight only illuminates to 800, you're firing at shapes you can't properly identify. Syrian gunners were shooting at muzzle flashes at suspected positions, at movement they thought they saw. hit probability drops catastrophically under those conditions. Meanwhile, Greengold's gunners were using the Syrian searchlights against them. Every time a T-55 lit up its IR beam, it became a beacon. Israeli tanks could see the source, range it, fire at the illuminated vehicle before the Syrian crew realized they'd just marked themselves. The temperature differential mattered too. Golan gets cold at night in October, down to maybe 10 degrees Celsius. Tank engines retain heat for hours after shutdown. A T-55 that had been running until 5 minutes ago would show warmer than ambient background through starlight optics, just from residual engine heat. Not much, but enough for an experienced gunner to distinguish vehicle from terrain. Syrian crews weren't incompetent. They were using their equipment as trained, executing doctrine that worked fine in coordinated operations with proper support. But piecemeal night actions against an enemy who kept violating the expected pattern, that's not what they'd practiced. And the longer the fighting continued, the more exhausted everyone became, the worse those equipment advantages degraded into basic survival reflex. By October 9th, some Syrian units were leaving their IR searchlights off entirely. Easier to move in darkness than advertise your position. The intercepts came through IDF, signals intelligence units monitoring Syrian tactical frequencies. Most of it was standard combat traffic, fire missions, position reports, casualty notifications. But on October 8th, around 11 a.m., one conversation stopped making sense. Two Syrian company commanders, call signs Fajr 2 and Fajr 5, both reported holding the same grid square northeast of Hushnia. Not adjacent squares, the same one. Fajr 2 was requesting artillery support against Israeli armor at coordinates that put the enemy exactly where Fajr 5 said his own tanks were positioned. The battalion net went quiet for maybe 40 seconds. Then the battalion commander came on, asking Fajr 5 to confirm his position. Fajr 5 repeated the coordinates. The commander asked Fajr 2 to confirm enemy location. Fajr 2 repeated the same coordinates. Another pause. Then the commander ordered both units to halt and maintain position until confusion was resolved. Israeli translators listening to this couldn't determine what happened next. The radio traffic shifted to a different frequency, probably encrypted battalion command net. When tactical traffic resumed 12 minutes later, Fajr 5's call sign was no longer transmitting. Fajr 2 reported continuing advance, gave new coordinates that placed his unit 600 meters south of where he'd been. I spent time trying to figure out what actually occurred in that grid square. The IDF after-action reports don't clarify it. Syrian unit histories from that division don't mention October 8th in detail. One possibility is Fajr 5 took casualties and his surviving vehicles fell back without reporting it, while Fajr 2's unit moved into the same position thinking it was contested. Another possibility is map coordination errors. Syrian forces were using Soviet-supplied maps that didn't always align perfectly with local terrain. Or maybe both commanders were just wrong about where they were. 4 days of continuous combat, sleep deprivation, dust obscuring landmarks, taking fire from multiple directions. Map reading degrades. You think you're in one place? You're actually 800 meters displaced. Your reports to higher headquarters create a tactical picture that doesn't match reality. What's interesting is how often this pattern repeated in the intercepts. Syrian units reporting positions that conflicted with other Syrian units. Commanders asking for clarification on enemy strength, because the numbers their companies were seeing didn't match intelligence estimates. One battalion commander requested air support against estimated 30 to 40 enemy tanks, in a sector where Israeli forces had maybe 8 operational vehicles. There's another intercept from October 9th, around 6:30 hours. A Syrian brigade operations officer asking one of his battalion commanders, "How many enemy tanks have you destroyed?" The battalion commander responded, 17 confirmed, maybe 23 total. The operations officer then asked, "How many did you engage?" The answer was 17 confirmed. So, either the battalion destroyed every tank it engaged with perfect efficiency, or the counting was optimistic. Given combat conditions, the latter seems more likely. But that discrepancy compounds across a division. if every battalion is overcounting kills by 30%, and headquarters is building their operational picture from those reports, the math breaks. You think you're winning when you're actually stalemated. The intercept that stays with me is from late October 8th. Syrian company commander reporting to his battalion, "We have reached objective. No enemy contact." 30 seconds later, different voice on the same frequency. "Fajr 3 is taking fire, requesting support." Battalion comes back asking who's transmitting. The second voice says, "Fajr 3. Battalion says Fajr 3 just reported reaching objective with no contact. Long pause, then, "Contact now. Enemy position." And the transmission cuts off. Nobody knows what happened to Fajr 3. The call sign stops appearing in subsequent intercepts. Nafek was a logistics base and division headquarters compound sitting on high ground 11 kilometers from the Purple Line. If Syrian armor took Nafek, they'd control the road network that Israeli reinforcements needed to reach the front. The whole Golan defense would collapse into isolated pockets waiting for relief that couldn't arrive. By 10 a.m. on October 8th, Syrian tanks were 3 kilometers from Nafek. The compound was under direct artillery fire. Headquarters staff were burning classified documents and preparing to evacuate. Israeli forces between the Syrians and the Bays consisted of Greengold's remaining tanks, somewhere between 4 and 7 operational vehicles depending on which report you read, and scattered platoons from reserve units still mobilizing. The Syrian force pushing toward Nafek was elements of the 7th Infantry Division's armored brigade, maybe 80 tanks, supported by mechanized infantry and self-propelled guns. They'd broken through the initial Israeli defensive line and were exploiting the gap. Standard Soviet doctrine: identify weakness, concentrate force, push through before the enemy can seal the breach. Greengold's tanks were fighting from positions northwest of Nafek, trying to block the main approach route. The ammunition situation was critical now. His crews were down to maybe 15 rounds per tank, pulling shells from knocked-out vehicles when they could find them. Every shot had to count because there weren't enough shots left to afford mistakes. The Syrian advance slowed around 11:30 a.m., not because they'd been stopped, the numbers still favored them heavily, but because their lead elements kept taking fire from Israeli positions that shouldn't have been there according to their intelligence. Companies would advance, lose 2 or 3 tanks, halt to suppress the Israeli position, then discover the fire was now coming from a different direction. Israeli reinforcements started arriving around noon. A reserve armored battalion, maybe 20 tanks, coming up the road from the south. Not enough to decisively shift the balance, but enough to create uncertainty in Syrian tactical planning. Syrian commanders were now facing fire from multiple directions, unsure if they were fighting remnants of the initial Israeli defense or the leading edge of a major counterattack. The closest Syrian tanks got to Nafek was maybe 1,800 meters. Close enough that headquarters personnel could see them through binoculars. The compound's anti-tank teams were setting up hasty firing positions. If the Syrian armor pushed another kilometer, the base would have to be abandoned. Then the Syrian advance stopped. Not retreated, stopped. Tanks took hull-down positions, infantry dismounted, units consolidated. From Israeli perspective, it looked like they were preparing for a coordinated assault. From Syrian perspective, based on later interviews with captured officers, their commanders were trying to understand why Israeli resistance was increasing instead of collapsing. Syrian doctrine expected breakthrough to accelerate. Once you penetrated the defensive line, enemy cohesion was supposed to fracture. Reserves would be committed piecemeal, defeated in detail, and the breakthrough would widen into operational-level exploitation. But Israeli fire wasn't decreasing. If anything, it was intensifying as reserve units arrived. By 1500 hours on October 8th, the Syrian push toward Nafek had stalled completely. They held positions within striking distance, but the momentum was gone. Israeli reinforcements kept arriving. Another battalion at 1630 hours, artillery support by evening. The numerical advantage was narrowing. Syrian forces spent October 9th consolidating gains rather than advancing. By October 10th, they were defending against Israeli counterattacks. The offensive had stopped. Nafek never fell. Syrian tankers got close enough to see it, close enough that capturing it was tactically feasible. But feasible isn't the same as executable when you've been fighting for 4 days straight and nothing is going according to plan. The Patton sits in the Latran Armored Corps Museum outside Modian, hull number partially obscured by weathering. The placard identifies it as an M48A3 that served during the Yom Kippur War. Nothing about Zvika Force, nothing about October 8th near Nafek. Just the basic technical specifications and a date range. The burn marks are still visible on the turret's left side, where a Syrian round penetrated and ignited ammunition. You can see where the armor buckled from internal overpressure. The crew survived that hit. There's a 1982 interview with the gunner, but the tank was written off as combat loss. Somehow it ended up at Latran instead of the scrapyard. What the placard doesn't mention is that this specific vehicle changed crews 3 times during October 6th to 9th, 1973. First crew took a hit near Hushnia on the 7th, bailed out, tank was recovered by maintenance. Second crew fought it through the night of October 7th to 8th, ran out of ammunition, abandoned it when Syrian armor overran their position. Third crew found it at dawn on the 8th with 17 rounds still in storage. The second crew had miscounted or couldn't access the auxiliary rack, and drove it back into action. The hull shows impact marks from at least 9 separate engagements. Small arms fire, artillery fragments, 1 clean penetration low on the glacis plate that somehow missed the driver. The right track is replacement pattern, installed after the war. Original track was destroyed by a mine on October 9th. Museums preserve things selectively. Latran has maybe 60 tanks on display, representing 70 years of Israeli armored warfare. They chose this pattern for reasons the placard doesn't specify. Maybe the burn marks made it visually dramatic. Maybe someone in acquisitions knew its service history and thought it mattered. Or maybe it was just available when they needed an M48A3 for the 1973 display. There's no indication which crew this tank belonged to during the Nafek fighting. IDF records show Greengold commanded or fought from at least 11 different vehicles during 4 days of combat, swapping tanks as they were damaged, redistributing crews, using whatever was operational. This could have been one of his, could have been from a reserve battalion that arrived on the 8th. The documentation doesn't connect specific hull numbers to specific engagements. I asked the museum staff if they had provenance records. They pulled a file with maintenance logs showing the tank was rebuilt in 1974. Returned to service, finally retired in 1982. Nothing about October 1973 beyond combat damage, Golan Heights. What stays with you is the mundane physical reality of it. This isn't a special tank. It's a 1960s American design, upgraded with a British gun, crewed by reservists who learned tank operation during annual training. The armor is adequate, not exceptional. The gun is reliable, not revolutionary. Put it next to a Syrian T-55, and the technical specifications are roughly comparable. Both obsolescent by 1973 standards, both survivable only through superior tactics and crew skill. The museum opened in 1982. By then, the Yom Kippur War had been studied, documented, mythologized. Zvika Greengold received the Medal of Valor, Israel's highest military decoration. The broader Golan defense became case study material at military academies. Syrian generals wrote memoirs trying to explain what went wrong. But this tank just sits in a parking lot in Latran with a weathered placard and burn marks nobody bothers explaining to visitors. Hull number worn down to bare metal where rust broke through the paint. Someone laminated a Syrian map in 1973, preserving confidence that didn't survive contact. Someone else preserved this pattern, though they forgot to preserve why it mattered.